about borrowing credibility. I like to call that uh, using citations is actually we're borrowing credibility because as writers, we don't have our own credibility and we add credibility, believability to our writing by citing reliable sources, not just sources, but reliable sources. Okay? So we're going to talk about the best way. So first off, what's the reason, the real reason we are citing other sources? Well, it seems like a lot of extra work, right? And maybe it's just an attempt to, keep writers from simply just copying and, pasting in other people's work and saying, oh, this is theirs, right? And maybe in some ways that's true, but it has some other purposes too, right? So citations from reliable, trustworthy sources, right? So it means, good, dependable sources, right? They give the sources credit for information, especially specific information. So there's a purpose for that. So is that if you've learned something from someone and it's really something cool and interesting, you don't just go, hey, hey, did you know? No, no, no. We often say someone told me or this person told me, and we credit the source of that information. So that's one thing it does. Another thing it does is it improves the credibility of your writing, right? Is that it's not just some general thing that we're talking about. We have some specific data and the place that data came from, which means that maybe the reader can trust other things that you are writing and saying to them as well. Okay, so it also helps to explain where that information, especially if you have some statistics, some percentages, or some big numbers, or some values, or money prices, or something, right? Or a quotation, where that came from, right? Because oftentimes that uh, de deters the reader because the reader's wondering, oh, where does that information come from? How is it 6%? How is it, $40 billion or whatever that number is, right? So having good citations helps to explain, look, I didn't just pick this number out of the air, right? I didn't just make it up or I didn't just hear it somewhere. I have the source for that information and by citing using proper citations, it'll explain those things for us. It also lets the reader then verify that data and information for themselves. As a writing instructor, it's happened, where I'll get a paper and it will say, it's 600%. And I'm like, wait a minute, it can't be 600%. So let me go check the source. And sure enough, it says 60%. So it's just a typo. Right? But the other one is that we could always say, we could say it's 600% or it's 60% and say that it came from some journal or it came from some reliable source. And if the reader, and today's reader, I'm sorry, doesn't do this as much as they should, doesn't verify that, right? Uh, but most of the time, we want them that at least whenever they do go to verify it, that they're going to find that you quoted this person as saying this, or this paper as saying this, or this newspaper or magazine as saying this, or giving this data, and yep, that's what we found, right? So that's another thing that it does. It also lets the reader see some other related surrounding information, where that data came from, not just that percentage, that number, whatever that quote is, but in context, right? And what are some other things that might be related to that? So oftentimes you'll see some statistics or some quote or mention of a person or a researcher or a writer or something in a paper, and you will go and look and then you discover, oh, this is really interesting. There are some other things that are here. Okay, so let's talk about citing sources. But first, where you get your information also increases credibility. Right? So we don't want to just have like John's website, right? It can't just be, Bob's blog or, uh, my friend's Facebook post, right? This is just ridiculous. Can't be just some meme on the internet unless you're discussing about that, right? But you don't have to cite that source, right? Uh, Worse, these things that some people say, right? Some people say, or many people say, or the International Conference on Human Studies Journal. Oh, now this looks like it's very formal, right? And something that's trustable, believable, has credibility. Or the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very famous journal of medicine. So if research or papers or data is taken from there, then most of the time we can consider that to be a very highly reliable source. And maybe New York Times and other uh, newspapers and magazines that have some history of being truthful and accurate, but it could also be a book. It could be from a book by a known person, and that has to be related to whatever the data is that you're talking about. Right? So if you're talking about Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or Stephen Hawking, then so Bill Gates maybe something about computers or company culture, or Warren Buffett about investing, or Stephen Hawking something about physics and science, right, that kind of thing. If it came from that book, then oh wow, that's very reliable. I'm just going to trust that. Maybe I'm not going to have to go verify that. But if you say it's from John's website or Bob's blog, then I'm sorry, it's not a very credible uh, source for us. So where your information comes from also increases. So having citations increases credibility, but where those citations come from also increases. The other thing is how you reference your source matters as well. So uh, first, we can make like a general reference, right? Maybe in less formal writing, we might be able to just use uh, some simple quotations within our narration, right, within the narrative of what we're writing. But how well you do that, how well you do even that simple one, will affect your credibility. And just giving numbers and giving data and giving statistics and all of those things without citing the sources uh, really decreases your credibility, because it seems like you're taking responsibility for uh, finding or researching that data without giving credit to the source. Right? So how well you document it affects it, and we can do that in a simple way, right? We can do it just like within the narrative, right? Just we can include the author or the source name in your text and your narrative. So for a general quote or attribution, for example, maybe it's a famous or a well-known quote, you can just use the name or the source in your narrative too for a general quote. Right? So I'll give you a couple of examples here. So Mark Twain famously said, "It's not the size of the dog in the fight; it's the size of the fight in the dog." Right. So we don't need this to have some MLA, strict formal uh, method for citation here. It's a fairly well-known quote. A lot of people may not know that it came from Mark Twain, but it's not necessary to give the source for that other than the person, the author of that information, right? So maybe even something like the Bible, a very well-known book, right? So the Bible says, "Love one another and do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Now you could, find the chapter and verse of that and put, which edition and all of that information, but it's not really necessary. So you could do it, right? But it's not really necessary for you to include a formal citation, right? So we could look at some more formal. So if we want to have more formal styles of writing and some writing assignments and those kinds of things for publication for graduation papers and those things, then you're going to have a little more formal structure as well. It's going to be required for how included in your narrative. It's not always necessary to have quotation marks and parentheses, those things. But there is a very good, clear way to attribute, give credit to your source. For example, here, according to a recent Pew Research study, there have been increases of at least 5% over the last 3 years. Now, if your own writing just said there have been increases of at least 5% over the last 3 years, then this would seem very weak. Even weaker would be there have been increases or small increases or large increases over the last few years. So we see that that's a very, very general thing. So by using citations, we become more specific, and that specificity, being more specific adds to our credibility. So we give the specific data, 5% over the last 3 years, or increases of 5% over the last 3 years. So that increases our credibility a lot. But if we only use that without, well, where does that information come from, then it doesn't really help us. So Pew Research, the Pew Research Institute is very famous, very trustworthy research institute. So using them is going to increase the credibility of that statement. So we could use something like a website. So wanisan.com says, supporting teachers attempting to incorporate new methodologies into classes is essential to the future growth of students and instructors. So we just named the author, the source, right? So a website, wanisan.com, says this, and now we have the quotation marks. So it means that this text specifically came from that website. And in informal cases, we can get away with this, right? I mean, if you're reading the newspaper, they're not giving you, works cited at the end, but they are giving credit to that source. We could also do it for a person. So Alan Williams wrote, he believed students were becoming more and more reliant to their own detriment upon new technology. So it's kind of okay. We didn't say where did Alan Williams write those things, right? But it's possible we could find it if we needed to in a little less formal kind of situation. So we could also have uh, uh, this kind of thing in just a regular essay. But if I have some more uh, uh, formal needs here, then I could include them at the end in a works cited. So all of this data that I give you here, this Pew Research study or website or a person wrote, Alan Williams wrote, I could be able to include those sources at the end, right? So we could put that in a works cited list or a works referenced, right? Or references, those things. And for most of the time here, we're going to be talking about MLA format for doing that, right? So let's look at what MLA looks like. So even for our previous ones, right, then we have, right, so authors, family name, first name, period, quotation marks around the title of the article, right? So Devlin Cat, unlike in U.S., most European students learn a foreign language. Pew Research Center. So who's the publisher and the source, and then the date, right? So this is actually from a website, so I want to point that out too. That I'm not including the website URL. I'll talk about that more in just a minute. So there's the source for the Pew Research Center. Williams, Allen, Source Up Joe, Korean Conversations, Fun Korean Language, second edition, volume 1, publisher, 2015. So you get the family name, first name, other authors, title of the book in this case, and which edition, which volume, those things. Right? And then we could also do for the quote from wanisan.com. Right? So Williams, Allen, author's name, title of the web post, right? And the publisher and those things and the date. And websites often have the time that was published too. Right? So this is the way to formally then cite in MLA format the things that we just covered there. So it's not necessary in less formal writing, but it's the best way to do this whenever we move website URL. Uh, you can include that, but it's kind of ugly and it's kind of long. And the purpose of using the URL in your citation is if that article might be difficult to find otherwise. Here, if you search the internet for the title of any of these, you could find that. So if it's difficult to find the article, then go ahead and include the website URL. Also notice that these are now listed in alphabetical order, not in the chronological order, not in the order that they appeared in our example. So, and they're listed by author's name. So we have Williams Allen twice, but Williams Allen is included with and Sultup-Joe, so that puts that into alphabetical order. Makes that second. That's how that's going to show up order-wise. So now we talked about how to use a little less formal ways for citation. So I'm just giving the author name, the source name, and the text, and then possibly using works cited. So let's look at how to use a little more formal in-text citation. So let's see what it's like if we take that next step and we do a little more formal academic method for making our in-text citation. So we're going to be talking about how we can cite authors. We can also cite the texts themselves that it comes from. And also whenever you're using direct quotes. And direct quotes means that we're including some short phrases, maybe even longer phrases. And anytime we're using something exactly that we took from someone else's writing, then it can be cited this way in a more formal manner, and this is going to require just a little bit more than just throwing in the author's name, right? So, this method is acceptable for most essays, but there are other ways we can cite sources. And so if you're writing your graduation paper or a paper that you're hoping to have published, then you have to use a more specific method, this more formal method for doing your citation. And for more formal citations, for example, if you're MLA format, then you have to include in-text citations when you refer to or when you summarize, paraphrase, or quote directly from any other source. So this is going to be necessary, and you have to do it at that point and include works cited so that the reader can find that information. So for every in-text citation in your essay, you need that corresponding source in your works cited at the end. So not every work that you've used, that you've gotten information from, that has to have an in-text citation, but it does have to be included in your works cited at the end. So if you quote directly or you use specific data, then you can attribute that source and use it in text, right? And you must include it in the text and in your works cited or your bibliography. So sometimes we read and we have some ideas and we get some ideas, that some general ideas that we know came to us from listening to or reading or being exposed to different material, then that might get included in the list of your works cited without having a specific direct in-text citation. Okay, so whenever that happens, it's sometimes difficult even to know, right, that I read this and I got some ideas or I was inspired by this, even though I'm not directly quoting that source or reference it, but it somehow played a part in my research and coming to these thoughts or this conclusion that I have in my writing, then I really want to include that in my works cited, but I don't have to include it. In fact, I really can't include it, in my in-text citation. So they should be cited, and they should be formally cited and properly structured. And these kinds of things, though, sometimes in works cited, you'll see page number references, but these are definitely not going to need page number references because we won't know exactly where that came from.